They say in the West debts are paid in gold, in land, or in blood. But on that cold autumn morning when the rich cowboy rode up to the broken-down ranch with a ledger in his hand and darkness in his eyes, nobody expected what he would take instead. The girl standing in the doorway didn't know that her father's gambling had sealed her fate, that the man on the black horse had come not just for money but for something far more valuable. And she certainly didn't know that before the sun set that day, her entire world would shatter, reshape, and lead her down a path where love and danger walked hand in hand through the unforgiving mountains. This is the story of how a debt became a destiny, and how a girl with nothing left to lose found everything she never knew she needed. The dust cloud appeared on the horizon just after dawn, and Emma wiped her flour-covered hands on her apron as she watched it grow closer. Her father hadn't come home the night before, which wasn't unusual anymore. Ever since Mama died 2 winters past, he'd been spending more time at the saloon than at the ranch, and the farm had fallen into disrepair. The fences sagged like tired old men, the barn roof had more holes than planks, and their last 3 horses had been sold off months ago to pay debts Emma didn't fully understand. She was 19 years old and felt 40, her hands roughened by work that should have been shared, her heart hardened by disappointments that came as regular as the seasons. When the rider finally came into view, she felt her stomach twist with the familiar dread that accompanied strangers these days. Strangers usually meant trouble, and trouble usually meant more things they couldn't afford to lose. The man who dismounted was nothing like the rough ranch hands or dusty drifters who occasionally passed through. His black coat was tailored and clean, his boots polished to a shine that seemed almost insulting in their poverty-stricken yard. He was tall and broad-shouldered, probably 30 years old, with dark hair that fell just past his collar and eyes, the color of a winter storm. But it was the way he moved that caught Emma's attention, the careful confidence of someone who'd never known real fear, never wondered where his next meal would come from. He pulled a leather folder from his saddlebag and approached the porch with the measured steps of a man on official business. Emma's hands clenched into fists at her sides. "Miss Emma Holloway?" His voice was deep and surprisingly gentle, which somehow made everything worse. She nodded once, not trusting herself to speak. "My name is James Blackwood. I own the Silver Creek Mining Company and the land office in town. I'm here about your father's debt." He opened the folder and Emma saw papers covered in numbers that made her head spin. "He owes me $8,000. Gambling debts, mostly, plus the loan he took out last spring that he swore he'd repay by August. It's nearly November now. $8,000. Might as well have been $8 million. Emma felt the porch tilt beneath her feet. "We don't have that kind of money," she said quietly. "We don't have any money, James." Blackwood nodded as if he'd expected exactly that answer. His eyes traveled over the failing ranch, the peeling paint, the empty corrals, and something like regret flickered across his face. "I know. That's why I'm here to claim the property, the land, the buildings, everything. You'll have until the end of the week to gather your belongings and leave." Emma's mind raced. Leave? And go where? They had no family, no friends wealthy enough to take them in, nowhere to go, except maybe to join her father in whatever gutter he'd drunk himself into. The thought of losing the last piece of her mother, the home where she'd been born and raised, made something fierce and desperate rise in her chest. There must be something else, she heard herself say, some other way to settle this. "James." Blackwood studied her for a long moment, and Emma saw something shift in his expression. Something calculating, and yet not entirely cold. "There might be," he said slowly. "I didn't come here planning to make this offer, but I need a wife." The words hung in the air between them, like gun smoke. Emma blinked, certain she'd misheard. "You need a what?" He had the grace to looked slightly uncomfortable. A wife. I'm building a business empire, Miss Holloway, and in this territory, a man's not taken seriously without a family. I need someone respectable at my side. Someone to manage my household and represent me at social functions. It would be a business arrangement, nothing more. In exchange, your father's debt would be forgiven, and he could keep this property. Emma's laugh came out bitter and sharp. You want to buy me like I'm one of your mining claims. But even as she said it, her mind was already turning over the possibility. What choice did she have? She could refuse and lose everything, watch her father drink himself to death in some alley, end up working in a saloon herself just to survive. Or she could say yes to this cold-eyed stranger and at least save her home, give her father one last chance to pull himself together. It wasn't really a choice at all. If I agree, she said carefully, I want it in writing that this property stays in my father's name, that you can never claim it for any reason. And I want your word that you'll leave him alone after this. No more loans, no more gambling debts. Nothing. James Blackwood extended his hand. You have my word, and you'll have it in writing by tomorrow. Emma looked at his hand for a long moment, knowing that once she took it, everything would change forever. Then she thought of her mother's grave on the hill behind the barn, of the bedroom where she'd grown up, of the kitchen where she'd learned to bake bread. She thought of her useless, broken father who'd gambled away their future but was still the only family she had left. And she reached out and placed her rough, work-worn hand in his smooth gentleman's palm. Then I'll marry you, Mr. Blackwood. His fingers closed around hers, warm and firm, and she saw something flicker in those storm-gray eyes that might have been triumph or might have been something else entirely. The wedding happened 3 days later in the small church in town with no guests except the preacher and 2 witnesses James brought from his business. Emma wore her mother's old dress, altered to fit, and felt like she was walking through a dream, or maybe a nightmare. Her father had appeared the morning after James's visit, sober for once and devastated when he learned what Emma had agreed to. He'd begged her not to do it, swore he'd find another way. But they both knew he was lying. The debt was real, and there was no other way. So he stood beside her at the altar with tears streaming down his weathered face as Emma promised to love, honor, and obey a man she didn't know and wasn't sure she could ever trust. When James slipped the gold ring onto her finger, it felt heavy as shackles. They rode toward his mountain estate that same afternoon, Emma's few belongings packed in a single trunk tied to a pack horse. James had barely spoken since the ceremony, and Emma was grateful for the silence because she didn't know what to say to this man who was now her husband in name if nothing else. The trail climbed steadily into the high country, winding through pine forests that grew darker and more isolated with every mile. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of blood and fire, Emma saw his house for the first time. It wasn't the mansion she'd half expected, but rather a large, sturdy cabin built of timber and stone, positioned on a ridge overlooking a valley that stretched for miles. Smoke curled from the chimney and lamplight glowed in the windows, giving it an unexpected warmth that surprised her. "It's not fancy," James said, speaking for the first time in hours, "but it's solid and safe. You'll have your own room, your own space. I meant what I said about this being a business arrangement. Emma, I won't force anything you're not willing to give." She nodded stiffly, not sure whether to feel relieved or insulted. That night she lay in an unfamiliar bed in an unfamiliar room, and wondered what she'd truly gotten herself into. Sleep came in fitful waves, and she dreamed of her mother's face and hands reaching for her from across a distance she couldn't cross. The first few weeks passed in a strange, tense routine. James left before dawn each day to work at his mine or conduct business in town, and Emma found herself alone in the big house with more food in the pantry and more firewood stacked by the door than she'd seen in years. She cleaned and cooked and tried not to think too hard about what her life had become. But slowly, almost against her will, she began to notice things about James Blackwood that didn't fit the cold businessman who'd come to collect a debt. He always made sure the woodpile was stacked high before the weather turned. He brought her books from town without her asking, somehow knowing she loved to read. He never raised his voice and he never drank, and when he looked at her across the dinner table, there was something in his eyes that made her heart beat faster in a way that confused and frightened her. One evening, about a month after the wedding, Emma was preparing dinner when she heard horses approaching fast and loud. She moved to the window and saw 3 rough-looking men dismounting in the yard, and the way they moved made alarm bells ring in her head. James was in his study, and she called to him with urgency in her voice. He came out quickly, and when he saw who was outside, his entire body went rigid. "Get upstairs and lock the door," he said, quietly, but there was steel in his voice. "Don't come out until I tell you it's safe." Emma wanted to argue, but something in his face stopped her. She hurried to the stairs, but paused on the landing where she could see and hear what happened next. The men came in without knocking, and Emma recognized the leader as Colt Brennan, a notorious outlaw who'd been terrorizing the territory for years. "Well, well, James Blackwood," Colt drawled, his hand resting on his gun. "Heard you went and got yourself married. That's real sweet. Also heard you've been refusing to pay our protection tax. That's not so sweet." James stood his ground, his hand nowhere near the gun. Emma suddenly realized he wore at his hip. "I'm not paying protection money to thieves, Colt. I never have, and I never will. Now get off my property." Colt laughed, and it was an ugly sound. "See, that's where you're wrong, friend. Because we know all about your little bride and that sad story of how you bought her off her drunk daddy. Real romantic. Be a shame if something happened to her, or if word got around town about how James Blackwood treats women like property." Emma's breath caught, but what James said next shocked her even more. "You don't know anything about my marriage or my wife, and you don't get to use her name in your filthy mouth." His voice had dropped to something dangerous and controlled. "I've let you run wild in this territory because sheriff's too scared to stand against you, but you don't threaten what's mine. Emo, you've got 10 seconds to get back on those horses before I make you regret ever riding up this mountain." The tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. Colt's hand tightened on his gun, and Emma saw the 2 men behind him shift their weight, ready for violence. She didn't think, didn't plan, just acted. She grabbed the rifle James kept loaded by his bedroom door, cocked it loud enough for everyone to hear, and aimed it down at the men from the landing. He said, "Get out," she said, proud that her voice didn't shake even though her hands were trembling. "And I suggest you listen, because I grew up on a ranch and my mama taught me to shoot before she taught me to read. I can take at least 2 of you before you clear those holsters." 4 sets of eyes turned up to her in surprise. Colt's expression went from shock to calculation to grudging respect. "Well now," he said slowly, "looks like you got yourself a real spitfire, Blackwood. This ain't over, but we'll leave for now, out of respect for the lady with the rifle." The 3 men backed toward the door, keeping their hands visible, and mounted up. But as they rode away, Colt turned in his saddle and called back, "You can't protect her forever, Blackwood. Eventually you'll slip up, and when you do, we'll be waiting." When their hoofbeats finally faded, Emma slowly lowered the rifle, her arms shaking with delayed fear. James took the stairs 2 at a time and gently took the gun from her hands. "That was the bravest and most foolish thing I've ever seen," he said, and his voice was rough with emotion. "They could have killed you, Emma." She looked up at him and saw something in his face that made her heart skip. "They were going to hurt you," she said simply. "I couldn't just hide and let that happen. He stared at her for a long moment and then did something completely unexpected. He reached up and cupped her face gently in his hands. "I didn't buy you, Emma. I know that's how it looked, and I won't pretend the circumstances weren't terrible. But from the moment I saw you standing on that porch, so fierce and proud despite everything you'd lost, I wanted to protect you. I wanted to give you a better life. Maybe that was wrong of me. Maybe I should have found another way, but I need you to know the truth." Emma's throat tightened with tears she'd been holding back for weeks. "What truth?" she whispered. James's thumb brushed her cheek with heartbreaking gentleness. "That I fell in love with you before I ever offered you my hand. That every day since has been torture, living in the same house and pretending I don't feel what I feel. That debt was real, Emma, but I would have found a way to forgive it if you'd told me to leave. I only made that offer because I was desperate for a reason to have you in my life, and I know that makes me selfish and probably a coward, but it's the truth." The world seemed to hold its breath. Emma thought about the past month, about all the small kindnesses, the careful respect, the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching. She thought about how she'd started looking forward to their quiet dinners together, how her heart jumped when she heard his horse in the yard, how safe she felt in this house, on the mountain despite everything. "You're an idiot, James Blackwood," she said softly, and then she rose on her toes and kissed him. It was awkward and unpracticed and absolutely perfect. And when they finally broke apart, they were both breathing hard and smiling like fools. But their happiness was short-lived, because 3 days later, Emma was in the garden when she heard something that made her blood run cold. Voices carrying on the wind, rough and familiar. She crept closer to the tree line and saw Colt Brennan and 5 other men making camp in the valley below, close enough to watch the house but far enough to stay hidden. They were planning something, and Emma knew with sick certainty that they were going to attack. She ran back to the house and found James going over his accounts. When she told him what she'd seen, his face went pale and then hard. "We need to get you to town where you'll be safe," he said immediately, but Emma shook her head. "By the time we ride out, they'll see us and follow. We'd never make it. We have to stand and fight." James looked at her like she'd lost her mind. "I'm not risking your life in a gunfight with outlaws." "Emma, I won't do it." But Emma grabbed his arm with surprising strength. "You don't get to make that choice for me anymore. I'm your wife, James, and that means we face this together. Besides, you need me. You're 1 man against 6, but together we have a chance." She saw the conflict in his eyes, the fear and the pride and the love all tangled together. Finally, he nodded. "All right. But you do exactly what I say when the shooting starts. Promise me," she promised. And they spent the rest of the afternoon preparing. The attack came at dusk, just as James had predicted. The outlaws tried to sneak up in the growing darkness, but James and Emma were ready. They'd fortified the house, barricaded the doors and windows, positioned themselves at strategic points with loaded guns and extra ammunition. When the first shot shattered a window, Emma felt fear like ice water in her veins. But she pushed it down and fired back. The battle raged for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. James moved through the house like a man possessed, his shots precise and devastating. Emma held her position and tried to keep her hands steady as bullets tore through the walls around her. She managed to wing one of the outlaws and drive another back into cover, and somewhere in the chaos and fear, she felt a wild surge of pride that she was fighting beside the man she loved instead of cowering in fear. Then she heard James cry out in pain, and her heart stopped. She turned and saw him on the floor, blood spreading across his shoulder. Colt Brennan had gotten inside somehow, was standing over James with his gun aimed at his head. "Should have paid the tax, Blackwood," Colt said coldly. Emma didn't think, didn't hesitate, just swung her rifle around and pulled the trigger. The shot took Colt in the chest, and he went down hard, surprise frozen on his face. The other outlaws, seeing their leader fall, lost their nerve and fled into the darkness. Emma dropped her gun and ran to James, her hands shaking as she pressed fabric against his bleeding shoulder. "Don't you die on me, James Blackwood," she said fiercely through her tears. "Don't you dare die now that I've finally figured out I love you too." He laughed weakly and then winced in pain. "Wouldn't dream of it, Mrs. Blackwood." She got him bandaged up and into bed, and then sat beside him through the long night, holding his hand and listening to him breathe. The next morning, the sheriff finally showed up with a posse. Drawn by reports of gunfire, they found the outlaws, camp abandoned, and Colt Brennan dead on James's floor. The sheriff promised that the rest of the gang would be hunted down and brought to justice, that the territory would finally be safe from their terror. It seemed like an ending, but Emma knew it was really a beginning. James recovered slowly, and Emma nursed him with fierce devotion, scolding him when he tried to do too much and reading to him from the books he'd given her. One afternoon, as she sat by his bedside with sunlight streaming through the window, he took her hand and said, "I want to do this right, Emma. I want to court you properly the way I should have from the beginning. I want to earn your love instead of buying it with a canceled debt." Emma squeezed his hand gently, feeling the gold ring on her finger catch the light. "You already earned it, you stubborn fool. You earned it when you respected me enough to give me a choice, even if it was a terrible choice. You earned it with every kindness, every small consideration, every moment. You treated me like I mattered, and you earned it when you stood between me and danger, willing to die to keep me safe." She leaned down and kissed him softly on the forehead. "The debt brought us together, James. But it's not what keeps us together. That's something we chose, both of us, when we decided to fight for each other instead of running away. So no more talk about what you owe me or what I owe you. We're even, and we're together, and that's all that matters now." James pulled her down beside him on the bed, careful of his injured shoulder, and held her close while the mountain wind whispered through the pines outside and the afternoon sun painted gold across the floors of the home they'd defended together. Emma thought about the girl she'd been just months ago, standing on that broken porch, watching a stranger ride up to collect her father's debt. She'd thought her life was ending that day, that she was being sold into a loveless arrangement with no hope of happiness. But sometimes the worst moments of our lives are really doorways to something better, if we're brave enough to walk through them. James Blackwood had come to take what was owed, but what he'd taken instead was her hand, her heart, and her future. And in return, he'd given her something no amount of money could ever buy, a home where she was cherished, a partnership built on respect and courage, and a love that had been tested by fire and proven true. The debt was paid not in gold or land or blood, but in trust and devotion and the promises. They whispered to each other as darkness fell over the mountains and a new life began.